was going to go ahead and get started, so we're sort of on time. But if anyone knows people who are still wandering in, or if you need to wander in and out during the talk, I will not take offense. Do what you got to do. So I'm coming from Stanford Children's. I am going to gear this talk a little bit towards the pediatric side of genetic epilepsies, but I'm happy to entertain other questions, and a few people have come up with their backgrounds. Can I just get a show of hands of people who are at this talk because you think your kid might have a genetic epilepsy? Of those people, like, anyone actually have a diagnosis, or is it we don't know? Somebody does. Okay, a couple people do. So some of you guys may actually know more about your specific diagnoses than I do. It often happens when you spent your whole life researching this. So feel free, if you have things that might help others in this room, to pitch in, because that's one of the great advantages of this conference. How many folks are adults with or friends of adults with epilepsy? About half? Okay, so like a lot of adults. All right, so I apologize that my talk is a bit peds heavy, but we'll do what we can to also just talk about what's exciting right now in genetics. Okay? All right, so this talk is Epilepsy Genetics, the Exciting Frontier. And I wanted to outline why is epilepsy genetics an exciting frontier right now, and what can it do both for you personally, if you are someone affected by epilepsy, and how are we working on the study of epilepsy in general, even if your disease is not going to be affected tomorrow. And I'm going to truly use 3 case examples to kind of try to drive home what's going on right now. But first, let's just kind of talk about what are genetic epilepsies, because I imagine some of you have lived your whole lives, you already know what this is, and other people are just getting interested because they don't have a diagnosis yet, but someone's mentioned that you might have a genetic epilepsy. So we think of genetic epilepsies, I think the first thing anyone thinks of when they think of genetics is, I have a family history of something, right? So others in my family have epilepsy. I think there are a few people in this room for whom that's the case. And that's certainly a group, as well as groups that are high risk in terms of, well, we know in your particular ethnicity population or sub-regional population of where mom and dad came from, that there's a high risk of certain things. Those are all folks that we think of screening for genetic epilepsies. We also think of certain children who come out with congenital malformations, with certain things that are wrong perhaps with their skin. The skin and the nervous system form from the same part of the embryo. So when we see problems with the one, we may think of problems with the other and think to send for genetic epilepsy testing. But really, some of the most interesting groups that we test for genetic epilepsies are just children who don't have anything different necessarily about the way they look. But they might be people who have intractable epilepsy, epilepsies that are hard to control. And they might be people also who have problems with their development, with their thinking, and with how they can do the things that normal people do, so speaking and processing. And when you have kind of those that seem out of proportion to anything that's really wrong with the structure of the brain, then we think about genetic epilepsies as a possible cause. And those are the group that might be more likely to get missed. The people who have a strong family history, perhaps someone will think to send you to a genetics center. So those are the groups of people we're talking about today. So if someone has a suspicion for a genetic epilepsy for you, then what? And some of you have been down that path and could probably give the lecture about then what. It can be a very long path. And it kind of depends where you start. So if you're someone who starts and you're already near an academic genetic epilepsy center, then you may go straight there, and you may get a very linear course of being referred through and dealing with geneticists and all that. If you're not, then you may have some testing that's done locally first, and someone may really want to be confident that you have that diagnosis before they ask you to spend the time and the resources going to an academic center, especially if it's farther away. So usually we start with a general evaluation, a really good history and physical exam, and that should, for kids at least, and really for adults too, that should involve pretty good look at your body too, like looking at your skin, taking off clothes, like seeing the structures that are there, because it can give a good idea of whether there are any things that might go with your epilepsy that would give us clues. And then existing testing should also be reviewed. So for folks in California, that usually includes a California newborn screen test that was done just when you were born. It usually includes any prenatal, so some people have prenatal genetics. Some people have prenatal imaging findings that might be relevant, like from ultrasounds. And so those things should go into the hopper if there were any concerns on any of those. And then any existing tests. So some people already come into the doctor having had an MRI or some blood tests. And then almost everyone, as they get worked up, is going to end up getting an EEG. So EEG is the stickers on the head to check brain waves, which a lot of you have probably had or know someone who has. Really, it would be good for that EEG to include awake and asleep states and an MRI of the brain. With a few exceptions. There are some epilepsies that are very easily classified before that and might not need an MRI, but usually people get an MRI when they're talking about genetic epilepsy. And then after that, that's when people, your doctors, whether they're in a center or not in a center, may really start to suspect a genetic epilepsy if those things are lining up in a way that suggests either that we don't have a good structural cause for an epilepsy in your brain, or that some of the features of your EEG or your story may point, or your exam may point to something like a genetic epilepsy. And once that happens, usually some genetic testing might get sent. For some people, that's a cheek swab. For some people, that's a blood test. And for some people, it's even testing family members in a group. And it may include a number of genetic tests before we get to the point of a diagnosis or of referring you to a special center. And then it also sometimes includes some specialist referrals. So if, for instance, some of the findings with your brain scan or with your EEG suggest a possible genetic diagnosis that we might have a clue from looking in the backs of your eyes. You may get sent to the eye doctor, the ophthalmologist, or you may get sent to a heart specialist who would look to see if there are problems with your heart. And we'll get to some of these things as we get to some cases in a few minutes. And then I'd like to say, I'm sure there are people in this room who've been down that entire path and they still don't have a diagnosis. And it happens, It's a very frustrating and long path sometimes. But there are really, in the way that I'm saying, exciting frontiers, there are now a number of NIH undiagnosed disease clinic centers. Stanford Children's happens to be one of them, but there are, a number, I think 30 or so across the country. And so when you're at the end of the line with having done everything your doctors think is standard, there's still more hope of where you can go to try to, really get a diagnosis and keep working.
Stanford would be up in the Bay Area, so is there anything down this way?
I think UCLA may have one as well. I'm not 100% with the undiagnosed disease clinic. So second question becomes, after now we understand what you might go through to consider genetic epilepsy, what can epilepsy genetics actually do for you? And I get a lot of questions from my parents that are, well, why would I go through all this testing if it's not going to cure my child? Right? Like, if I find this answer, then are you going to give me a stem cell therapy and then my child's going to be just fine? And really right now, for the most part, that's not the case, right? So I'm not going to get one gene answer and that's suddenly going to fix you. But I'd like to convince you today that it is starting to be the case that we have some diseases for which we can have a pretty significant impact if we actually diagnose and you get involved in some of our cutting edge treatments. But in addition to that, there's a couple other reasons. So first one is it still can give you some really valuable information. And the types of information that can include, so knowledge of what to expect, like a range of outcomes that your child might have, even some things other than just seizures that you might now expect or understand, monitoring recommendations for other things besides seizures. So for some of our diagnoses, we know that there's a high risk, for instance, of sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. And that might prompt you to want to get some additional monitoring, right, to keep your child safe. Or we might know that along with the brain defects that go with some disorders, go heart defects. And if those two things are together, we may need to send your child to the or yourself to the cardiologist to get checked, right? And see if there are things that we can do to keep other organ systems safe and functioning. Testing for family if desired. So if a child or an adult knows that he or she has a genetic diagnosis, then parents may want to get tested in case they want to have further children. Other people in the family who've never had a diagnosis may now know something that they want to get checked about and have additional information about the family history going forward. Some people may like that, others may not like that. But if you're the person involved in getting tested, it's mainly about you and what you need for your disease, and others certainly have the prerogative to get tested or not. Peace of mind. So some people go their whole lives with this really difficult problem that takes a lot of their time and energy, and they never have a name for it. They never have an answer for what it is that's taking up all this time and energy and giving them all these troubles. And so just having a name to the problem and then the ability to reach out to others with similar problems, maybe the same diagnosis, and get tips and tricks. It can provide a lot of solace, it can provide a lot of resource to actually know what you're dealing with. The flip side, so I said this can give you very valuable information, and I truly believe that, or I wouldn't send all the testing that I do. But the flip side is it can also provide uncertainty. And so anytime you're going into a genetic testing, it's a good idea to be in really a good trust relationship with the provider who's doing that testing, because you're going to be on a little road together for a while, right? There may be a series of tests that get sent, and none of them provides an answer. It's still almost 50% of people with epilepsy that we don't have their diagnosis of what's causing their epilepsy. That's a lot, right? So we will take you as far down that road as we can, and you've even heard about the undiagnosed disease clinic, but it may be that it's a frustrating ride, and it may also be that your test comes back with a variant of unknown significance, right? So variants of unknown significance is kind of like, I have blue eyes, some of you here in the audience have brown eyes. Neither of us has a problem with our eyes, right? We both have variants within the population. And neither of those is a bad thing or a pathogenic thing, right? They are what they are, they're variants. When it comes to epilepsy genes, there's people who have brown-eyed epilepsy genes and blue-eyed epilepsy genes. There's probably also people who have violet-eyed epilepsy genes, right? And that's very rare, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's causing a problem. Unless we have a nice publication or a nice model that shows how this causes a problem, we're sometimes left in limbo where we're like, well, we don't know exactly if this is what's causing your epilepsy. And there are things we can do to follow that up, but it involves a good relationship between the provider and the patient and being able to live during the time that we're following it up with that uncertainty. Like, well, maybe someone's found the cause for my disease, but I'm not sure yet. And that's a hard place to be. So that's the flip side. And some of you may have seen there's a Wall Street Journal article not that long ago about a little girl named Esme, whose family went down a long genetic road with multiple diagnoses and misdiagnoses, and a lot of these were variants that came up on genetic testing. And it was really rocky for the family because they pinned their hopes on one thing and they would switch to another. So really having a good relationship with your doctors to be able to understand the uncertainty and whether this is a diagnosis or this is something we're kind of working with, but we're not sure. That's a really key thing to have, and hopefully we provide that for those who come to us. There are a lot of great academic centers that do. All right, and then the second main thing I think that genetics can do for you is it can help your child and others with a condition like your child, or yourself and others with a condition like yourself, in the long term. So for some conditions, it can help right away in guiding treatment choices. How many people know about Dravet Syndrome? Almost everybody, right? Any Dravet folks in the room who want to identify themselves? No, okay. So Dravet Syndrome is usually very refractory epilepsy with epileptic encephalopathy. It's kids who have really easy seizures with temperature, with getting sick. They often are quite refractory. They also have development problems. And these children, we know a few things about. So one thing we know is that quite a subset of them don't respond very well to sodium channel blocking medicines. And in fact, those we give sodium channel blocking medicines sometimes can make their seizures get worse. We'll talk a little more about it because I have a case that goes with that. But knowing that right off the bat, we could maybe pick better seizure medicines for that person if we have a diagnosis. The second part is some children with Dravet syndrome also have part of their brain that's a little bit misformed, or multiple parts. Now, in folks who don't have a genetic diagnosis of Dravet syndrome, and we find a part of your brain that's a little bit misformed, and we know there are seizures that might be coming from there, we all go straight down the epilepsy surgery path once you've failed a couple of meds, because it is the most likely way to make folks seizure-free who have refractory epilepsy if they have a lesion there. But for Dravet folks, it doesn't work so well. So knowing that going in, we can say, we know you have a lesion here. Doesn't mean 100% we would never do surgery, but we're going to take a really good hard look before we cut something, because we know the outcomes in those with a spot plus Dravet are not good like they are, really high success rates like they are with other folks who don't have a genetic epilepsy as well. And so we want everyone to know that going in if we want to even consider surgery at all. So hopefully those are good examples of why, even in real time, this is guiding good treatment choice if we have more genetic information. Second point, which I'm sure you all are aware of, is clinical trials, right? So if you have a diagnosis and there are ongoing clinical trials for your diagnosis and you have a refractory epilepsy, that's great, right? You have an opportunity to engage with those if you want to. You look like you want to say something.
No, I said I've been in one, so if anyone has questions, let me know.
Great. Okay, you guys have resource here then. Third is certainly contributing to knowledge through research. So, even if things are going to be really bad and really rough for you, I know a lot of families who get solace from knowing that, hey, my child or myself is enrolled in a registry of people for this disease, and this is helping understand the disease and move forward. So even if my life right now is not better today, tomorrow, the next person who has my disease is going to be a little better off for the understanding we're able to gain. And then the last one is that some research, of course, may be even in real time able to help you or your child if you have a known genetic diagnosis. And this, of course, is the dream, right? It's an individualized medicine actually coming to you during your lifetime. And this is where the holy grail of what we're all getting excited about on this frontier. So I'm going to give you now our 3 cases, which hopefully are a little shorter than my last blabbing. But they should be able to outline a little bit of what we're doing with that right now. Okay? Questions before I go on out of the kind of general topics? Everybody's quiet. All right, we'll do cases, and then hopefully at the end, folks can ask if you want to. So, case part 1 is for clinical trials. So usually when folks come to our epilepsy genetics center, we start out by figuring out, is this someone that we can get into an existing trial if they're interested? And we certainly want you to have information about what trials are out there. So for instance, I have a little girl with a CDKL5 mutation. This is kind of an atypical Rett syndrome type picture. And she got diagnosed quite early, like her first year of life. So there are clinical trials. They don't start, the ones that are going right now that are interesting don't start until you're over 2. But that family has that information, and they can decide if they want to try to locate near a center. Stanford actually is not one of the centers for those trials. If they want to go ahead and affiliate with a provider who is a doctor for those trials, whether they're going to watch their child's course as well and see whether she's someone who really needs that or not. Additionally, of course, we're doing some trials right where we are, and one of them I'd like to plug as a very exciting trial. So anyone tuberous sclerosis affiliated? Yeah, in the back. So we have one of our doctors, Dr. Brenda Porter, you may know of, who's very passionate about tuberous sclerosis. She does an amazing job with epilepsy surgery for that, but she's also one of the heads of the PREVENT trial. Do you know about PREVENT? So for little guys, the idea is that with kids with tuberous sclerosis, they develop uncontrolled growth of small tumors at various places in their body. They do that in the brain. They also do it in the heart. So a lot of the time, very early on, even from in utero ultrasounds, we can see that there are little tumors in the heart. And then we say, well, there's not very many things that cause that. And tuberous sclerosis is one of the main ones. And we test very, very early. And we often know these kids before they ever start having seizures or epilepsy. So it's a really unique case, right? Because we see the storm coming, right? We know these kids are going to go down this road and develop seizures and epilepsy, and everyone wants to be able to stop that train. We actually have an opportunity to grab people before they start seizing, but what are we going to do before they start seizing? So this trial is trying to give a medication that's particularly efficacious. It affects the genetic pathway involved in tuberous sclerosis, and to try to give it to kids the minute that they develop any abnormality on their EEG test. So these kids that we pick up, they have like some tumors in their heart. Before 6 months old, we say, we're going to give you an EEG at 3 months, at 6 months, at regular scheduled ones. The minute something's wrong there, they start getting this medicine. And the idea is there's some preliminary data from Europe, from the EpiStop study, that this actually can help prevent people from moving on to have really bad seizures called infantile spasms, and later on refractory epilepsy. So this is actually hopefully a trial that's getting at stopping epilepsy rather than just stopping seizures. So everyone's super excited about it. Dr. Porter's still trying to recruit at least one more person, I know. So if anyone knows anyone less than 6 months old with tuberous sclerosis, send them our way. But it may not be someone who's here because they're probably not someone who's seizing yet or who knows what Mickey Mouse is. So, so this is ongoing and very exciting. And so similarly, these clinical trials have not yet started, but there are some really exciting upcoming trials for Dravet Syndrome with antisense oligonucleotide treatments. And I know that's a big mouthful, but the basic idea is kids with Dravet Syndrome have a faulty sodium channel. They also, most of them have one faulty sodium channel gene and one good sodium channel gene. So this trial is a drug that is a different kind of a drug. We can go into that eventually, but it's hopefully helping to boost the amount of good sodium channel that kids with Dravet make. So they make enough good sodium channel to kind of block out most of the bad sodium channel problems. It's worked very well in animal models so far. And it's a nice parallel to another disorder in neurology called spinal muscular atrophy, where kids are very weak. They eventually can't breathe because they're so weak and they pass away. And this is from birth. And they've given a similar kind of a drug that ups the expression of the good copies for that. And the kids have done amazing. They can sit up, they can roll over, and they don't die right after birth. So we've seen some really amazing results with a parallel disease. And now we're very hopeful that within the next year, there's going to be a clinical trial for this new option for Dravet. With epilepsy? Day of life 1 or 2.
Okay.
Very early.
Okay. And then, so the next question, would it be possible for the child to have seizures while still inside?
Some children actually do, and some parents will even report they think they can feel them. Now, that's a little suspect because most of us, including myself, who have someone in the bun in the oven, will say, you can feel a lot of funny movements and you can feel hiccups. But I think in hindsight, if you have someone who comes out and is seizing right away, some people feel like, they already were seizing inside. There certainly is the ability to have that EEG activity even early. Yeah. I'm not aware if the question is followed of in utero trials. I'm not aware of any in utero trials as yet. That's a complicated drug delivery problem as well. All right. Questions or comments about clinical trial stuff for now, or should we save it for the end?
Do they do clinical trials?
You want to come sit down?
I'm caregiving at the same time, so I'm spotting when I'm listening.
Got it.
Do they do clinical trials for adults?
Stanford does certainly do clinical trials for adults. I don't know, Lucille Packard is the children's hospital, but Stanford University, like adult hospitals, Stanford hospitals and clinics, do clinical trials. I'm not sure about any going on with tuberous sclerosis right now. Yeah. Can we move you a chair back there, though? Yeah, let's just move, because nobody's sitting up here anyways. Oh, uh-oh. I'm dropping my mic. I knew that was going to happen at some point.
Okay.
Oh, somebody's got it. Good, okay.
We have one thing?
Yeah.
Trials.gov.
Absolutely. So you can research your own at clinicaltrials.gov, but the docs are pretty good at most of the academic centers at getting you dialed in with clinical trials, particularly if you ask. Like, we will go do some of that legwork for you, and we also all go to national conferences. So, we get to meet some of the folks doing these trials, especially if they're about anything we're passionate about. where all the peds epilepsy folks are going in early December. There's national conferences in Baltimore this year. So come talk to me if you've got a passion you want me to find out about. All right, second major kind of story, so new discovery and characterization of genetic problems. So another Dravet case actually, but like just for an example of what could happen with many different kinds of mutations. So had a 4-month-old who already came in with refractory seizures and epilepsy. She was having them induced by fever, by immunizations, and really fit a clinical Dravet syndrome picture very early on in her life. And so if you're at an institution where you see this stuff, the good thing is everyone's dialed in at me, worried about these diagnoses. And she got diagnosed before a year old with having Dravet. Now, Dravet is a clinical diagnosis, but we like to have some genetic backup. There's a few mutations that tend to go with Dravet syndrome. And the most infamous of which is SCN1A mutation, which is the sodium channel that I talked about. And so indeed, this child did have an SCN1A mutation, lined right up with her story and clinical picture. But she had this early kind of difficult course, and we looked at what was the specific change that was in her. So each person that has a problem with the sodium channel has their own unique problem with the sodium channel. There's some overlap. Some people have the same one, but some people have a problem with how the pore that conducts ions in the brain helps the brain conduct electricity. Some people have a problem with getting it stuck into the membrane. They have all different problems. And hers was actually the first instance of its kind of an amino terminus change that was a duplication. And it was a different thing that we don't normally see. So because she was at this academic center, we were able to get our geneticists involved. And they said, we bet this would interest a group of scientists who's studying sodium channel for Dravet. And so they actually got permission from the family. They were able to send her specific mutation to these scientists. And the scientists modeled that mutation in cells in a dish. And they found out that her change didn't actually make a bad channel. It made a channel that never got to the membrane at all. So she didn't just have a sodium channel that we needed to do something about, right? That whole sodium channel that she would have made from the gene if it had been proper was just not even getting there at all, not getting to the edge of the cell. So what does this do for us now? Like, well, for one thing, it tells us she may not have the same standard sodium channel blocking drug issues as other people with a faulty channel, right? We have to think through, okay, this is not bread and butter Dravet with a channel problem. This is a different thing. And as we think about how to treat this child, we're thinking about this differently now, right? Than just say, oh, she has Dravet syndrome, we're going to treat her just like everybody else. And secondly, it tells us more about Dravet syndrome, right? It tells us some of these kids are going to have real problems with certain sodium channel blocking agents. Some of them, we don't know how they're going to behave. And so Dr. Rubin's group was able to publish this together with the clinicians who saw the child. We put together a nice paper, so now it's out there for all epilepsy docs to be able to see and learn from about Dravet. And additionally, her cells are still in a dish with Dr. Rubin, right? It's not actually her cells, it's her change expressed in other cells. But so what are they going to be able to find out? Would they be able to find out what drugs might be helpful for this child? Maybe they can. Would they be able to find out, like in concept, how should we be treating children in general who have sodium channels that never even get to the membrane? They're certainly going to work on that, right? That's the idea of having these changes being given permission to go to the lab. And I love that about working where I work because, in cases where it's like, oh, Dravet syndrome, it's going to be this really bad epilepsy and parents are losing hope and not knowing what to do. Yes, it's going to be a rocky course still. There's no question. But to know that your child's change is going to affect how we understand this disease, and we're going to be continuing to study your child's change in a dish, that's pretty powerful. That's individualized medicine. And that's what we're really trying to get to for more and more folks with genetic epilepsies. All right, and then the last individualized medicine example that segues nicely into I'm going to give is about another kind of genetic epilepsy. This one that makes a real, well, I guess Dravet too, but both make an epileptic encephalopathy. And this is called a GRIN2A mutation. GRIN sounds like a very happy mutation, but it's not really. So this is a change in another kind of excitatory channel, the NMDA channel. Not the same as Dravet, but another similar kind of idea in that we think there's too much exciting signaling and these kids get seizures, but often even more profoundly than their seizures, they'd lose language. Now, losing language and losing your ability to think and speak that way is just huge for families, right? And so as much as I'm passionate about seizures and treating seizures, for me, one of the reasons I went into pediatric epilepsy is that the effects on development of some of these changes are the bigger problem, really, right? Like, you need your child, you need this person that you've brought onto earth to be the person that they are. And when you lose those things, it really bothers a lot of families even more than just the seizures, which are bad enough. So these children lose their language, and it really is profound. So some of them will start, they'll go to get sent to the hearing doctor because they'll just start saying, what? Like they literally can't hear folks who are talking to them because they just can't process the language that's coming in. And a lot of them will also speak in a very funny way. So one of my favorite little girls is 11. You know how 11-year-olds normally talk, right? You probably heard some of them at Disney. And this little girl, if you ask her about her puppy, she'll say one word, name of the puppy, one word, bark, one word, happy. There's no sentences. She can't describe the puppy. You ask her what she did this weekend, baby. And then her mom has to explain that there's a baby cousin that she saw. So she clearly experiences things, but she has no language to be able to get that out there. Now, I'll tell you about that child. Well, I finished telling you about her now. So she was out in the community, and she had only had something like 2 lifetime seizures. She was on plain seizure medicine just to control seizure. And no one had ever bothered to do a long-term EEG and figure out that she was making discharges from her brain all night long through all of her sleep. And that is what we think screws up the language for these kids. Plus, she didn't have a genetic diagnosis. So when we found that the EEG looked so bad, we went and got her a genetic diagnosis, and we found out that she has this known problem of GRIN2A mutation that we know makes this problem with continuous discharges, sleeping, and language problems. So all of a sudden, we have a whole different picture that we're looking at for this child who previously was just a weird child who doesn't talk very much, and she had 2 seizures. A lot of additional information, right? So this little girl has a counterpart with one of my colleagues who also has a GRIN2A mutation, and this, what we call acquired epileptic aphasia, also can't talk very well. But these 2 children are a great example of our individualized medicine these days. So not only have we done an interesting genetic job by working both of them up and finding out why they're not speaking properly and thinking, well, we have treatments for epilepsy that can also help your ability to talk. So we should at least be trying those for both of these children, right? Because even though they haven't had a seizure in years, you know, actually the child of my colleague had been also having some seizures, but the child that I'm seeing hadn't been, we still need to think about treating them because we could make their language and their life potentially a lot better. So the child of my colleague, they sent out his genetic testing, and he had one of the tried and true, like I described for Dravet, something's wrong with the channel, right? The channel is extra excitable, it's a gain of function, more excitation is going to come into his nerve cells, and we know that's what caused his problem with his epilepsy. And so he has an established mutation. It was something that we knew right away was wrong. And because of recent work that's been done with GRIN, we knew that some children who have extra signaling this channel will respond to some drugs that were already out there for totally different diseases that help to clamp down on this channel. So 2 of those they're called memantine and dextromethorphan. They both act on the overactive channel. They both are relatively benign drugs in terms of side effects, like they're not horrible meds as some of the seizure meds can be. And so he said, well, let's just try this for this child because it's been shown in some folks to help. Child's language has improved, and child seizures have improved significantly on this medicine. This child's been through all kinds of other anti-seizure medicines, but not targeted. And he's done much better on this one targeted medication than he had on all those other anti-seizure drugs. So wonderful news there. But then we went and looked at my child's mutation, right, my patient. And she actually has a different kind of a change in her same gene that has truncated the whole protein it was supposed to make, which means we don't think she's making any functional channel. So just not making anything that makes this excitatory channel. So why does someone who has an overexcitable channel and someone who has a channel that doesn't even get there at all, why did they both have the same kinds of problem? Very interesting problem conceptually, right? So people are still working on that basic science side of things, right, and studying that in the lab. But what are we going to do with my child? Are we going to give her the same medicines that are like trying to tamp down a little bit on a channel she doesn't even have? So that just doesn't make sense for her, right? That giving her a standard treatment for GRIN2A mutation patients doesn't make sense. We had to go further for her and look at individualized medicine. And so again, because she had a super interesting mutation, something different, her change, with her family's permission, is now expressed in cells in a dish at a lab at Emory. And they're working on trying to see what does that do to the excitability of cells with her change, to the connectivity, if they have differences in how those cells make connections with each other. Why does she have a problem that's similar to this other guy's problem when we expect the effects on the channel to be totally different? And in the meantime, we're working with her in other general treatments that we know help children with epileptic encephalopathies. So just to try to treat her language beyond her epilepsy, but not yet at something targeted, because she's got a funny new target that we have to learn about. So I hope some of those examples have given you a sense that I'm very excited. There are so many possibilities right now in the field of genetic epilepsies. And I hope you can also see how closely working with doctors that you feel you can trust at a good genetic epilepsy center is really key if you're someone who might have this diagnosis or who has a diagnosis and has questions about it. And certainly if I can help anyone get dialed in, come let me know. But you also are all a great resource to each other. So I'm going to open it for questions, and then certainly feel free to if someone has something to add, raise your hand too.
You have multiple types of seizures and multiple triggers and medications that are fully controlled if you have cancer treatment. Do you think genetics might play a role in that, like some sort of difference in your genetics?
Really broad question. What is this a question where there's thought to be a specific non-genetic cause, or we just don't know the cause?
I'm saying, could there be possibly at least part of it be some genetic cause if you have so many different types?
Certainly. I mean,
Is it possible for it to skip a couple generations, or do you always?
very good question. So depending on the mechanism of transmission, that's one thing, yes. Depending on whether you have a monogenic or a polygenic problem. So like there are some genes that don't cause trouble unless you've got a certain other stuff in the mix. And then also there are certainly de novo changes, right? So there's some changes that you got something from mom and or dad, and that's why you have your genetic problem. But there's also changes that, like, while the baby's dividing in here, makes me very nervous, that something changes and something goes wrong during that replication. And then that's a time when something could come up newly in an individual that's never been in the family before. Yeah, so I don't even know that it's necessarily the language area of the brain. For her, at least on EEG, pretty much the whole brain is pissed off. Like there's discharges coming from both temporal lobes, both kind of frontal and parietal lobes. So that's really a lot of she doesn't have too much going on in the back, like bad stuff, but that's really a lot of the brain. And so it's a good question, because why do some folks who have this continuous discharge have language preferentially affected, and some have more general processing? And we even see kids that have developmental regression globally. So like less ability to do motor skills, less ability to regulate their behavior, that also goes with these continuous discharges. I'm guessing that for GRIN in particular, it has to do with subregion expression within the brain, why it preferentially affects language, but it's not, no one has an exact answer on that. Somebody else was over back here. Yeah, so you might have missed the very beginning. Maybe I can update you afterwards a little bit, but generally there's some things that might point you in that direction. But also if there's really just been no other progress with other modalities like MRI, EEG, like there's no hints, then it's probably worth at least thinking about. And then it's up to you kind of how far you want to go down that road. Come up afterwards and we can kind of go over the beginning part again. Yeah.
My child had partial complex seizures as well as, and then he developed ESES. He's since grown out of it, out of the ESES. He's still on the medication, hasn't had a seizure in 9 years. And
Wow.
we did genetic testing at CHOP when he was like 8, a long time ago.
Yeah.
So I imagine you guys have found
More,
a lot more
certainly.
things, so it's probably smart to get him tested again.
It's smart to go back to genetics. So often we'll have our kids that have something that like ESES, unless there's a lesion, which sometimes a lesion in the thalamus or something like that can cause that picture, something you would see on an MRI.
And so
If it hasn't been suspicion for that, then I would check back in every year or two with genetics, because a good geneticist will update you every year or two, like this is what's happened in the last year or two. They often can go even back to your original genetic testing. Most of the companies these days will update. And so if they're, like for instance, if you have a variant of unknown significance and subsequently that variant is published somewhere as either being pathogenic or being benign, they will update your report for you. And they'll often send that to the geneticist and say, hey, now we know that this is for sure a mutation, or that this is for sure benign in another published case. I know Invitae and GeneDx both do that. Those are two that we work with pretty heavily. I'm not sure that they were doing that as much 8 years ago, but so it might be worth either revisiting with more testing if you need to, or just asking what can be done with what is existing.
we're going to Stanford.
You're always welcome to come see us, yeah. But I have a feeling the docs there are, a lot of our docs have trained at CHOP and various places on the East Coast, so. Oh, Chalk, okay. Yeah, you're close, so come on out. Yeah, CHOP is a long way.
In regards to the first case study about Dravet syndrome, what are some of the limitations of the anti-sex
Approach? That's a whole other discussion. Maybe we can talk afterwards, because I think there's probably a couple more general. Someone over here had a hand up.
Yeah, I did.
Go ahead.
But I thought you were put behind me, so.
I-
Did you have another question? No. Okay. So, this is more, one's a curiosity question. What is ESCS? I don't recognize.
That's electrical status epilepticus of sleep. And it's sort of what I was mentioning is continuous bad activity while you're sleeping, that in the case of a GRIN mutation makes this Landau-Kleffner syndrome, this acquired epileptic aphasia, not being able to understand or speak very well language, losing language, and losing, in some cases, more broadly, developmental skills.
An acronym I wasn't familiar with, had to ask.
Yeah.
And then more general question about the history of genetics, because, I think back to the fact that, things like CTs and MRIs didn't come around until the, early to mid 70s.
Yeah.
And I know, for years, decades, they thought, epilepsy was genetic. That's why they had things like, what was it called? All the laws that prevented marriage or, forced sterilization, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Eugenics, there we go. So, when did the study of genetics itself get started? And not just with epilepsy, but as a whole? When did they start actually studying all that?
Well, that question goes back to Gregor Mendel, right? Like in his pea experiments, people have studied genetics for as long as they've studied breeding for agriculture, right? Because it's always been important to know, you want the good cow for this and the good cow for that, or the good bean plant for this and the good bean plant for that go together to make progeny that will be very productive. Yeah.
So many strides have been made, like just say in the last decade.
Absolutely. So if you look
When
at
did they
the,
really start,
well, like Dravet, for instance, and some of those syndromes have been, known for decades, and have gotten more study. But really, if you look at, there's beautiful graph in one of the papers that everybody likes to present on genetics. And it makes this nice curve where it's like goes up like this, and all of a sudden in the last 10 years just goes exponential in terms of the rate of discovery. Part of it going with the technology, right? So up until the last 10 to 20 years, 10 to 15 years, sequencing people's genes has been a very laborious, slow, costly process. Even if you think about computation abilities, once you have that sequence, right, you think about how much less space and less time it takes us to process the same things now. So these things have come together both with our sequencing technology, the cost of sequencing technology, and the computation needed to process all that, and come together to really make us, we've identified now so many more mutations, because now I can find out every letter in your code in a 2-week period of time without a big problem. And so that's, I only can assume that will go faster in the future.
I just have a question, and sorry, it's about my kid, but he was diagnosed with generalized genetic epilepsy, but my doctor never said go for genetic testing. Why wouldn't he? I'm kind of confused on that. The more I hear about it,
Yeah.
it seems like that would be the most logical step.
Well, so I can't really comment on individual cases, not knowing, but there are a lot. So in terms of generalized epilepsies that don't really have a lot of other features.
It was genetic. He said genetic. Because my husband.
Yeah.
So he just
Yeah.
genetic.
I would
So they
think.
don't know.
I would think if you had come to us and you had a family history plus a child with a similar kind of history, we probably would have sent you to genetics, especially if you wanted to go. That said, there are a lot of generalized epilepsies, unless they have some special features, there's an awful lot that we know they're genetic, but we don't know what causes them. There has been some progress, but it's
Done any good, basically? Is that basically the reason?
hard to know. As I said, I think we still would have probably put you in that hopper and tried. And it depends also on the specific features that might have led us down one path or another. Yeah.
Okay, for adults, now, we're talking about where children are and what the possibilities are. Do you think that for adults there's much likelihood that these individualized medicines might be coming up anywhere in the future, workable future, or are they too far out there?
No, I do think so. So I think it's a little bit different picture in that you're not going to be part of the trial that's trying to prevent epilepsy from the get-go, right? Like, because adults already have their epilepsy by the time they're coming in. But that certainly doesn't exclude from the clinical trial groups, right? For new treatments for specific diseases, for individualized medicine purposes of finding out what change is it that makes your epilepsy, and is it likely to benefit from X or Y drug or not, right? Those things all apply equally to adults as they do to kids. The only piece that's missing is we're going to catch you before the seizures even start kind of piece, because that ship has probably sailed by the time you know you have a genetic epilepsy as an adult.
So the best bet would be like keep applying for clinical trials and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and at least have a doctor that you can talk to about, what is my change? Is my change a known change that we know what to do with, or is it something different that might be of interest to researchers? Can I get
Are you saying chain, C-H-A-I-N?
CHANGE, change? Your genetic change? What's different in in you that's causing your epilepsy that apparently someone knows about if you have a genetic epilepsy? Maybe someone doesn't always know about what it is, but if someone knows what it is, then I think you can certainly ask questions about, number one, do I just qualify for any clinical trials off the bat? And number two, is there anything in terms of individualized medicine that might apply to me in my case?
Hi, we just had a question regarding kind of your recommendation. Our son is 17 and has epilepsy, and as we're moving forward and he's getting ready to go to college to do the life stuff, one of the things that the neurologist has talked about is the probability of having children, and something
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about that? I know he's going into adulthood. He is still with a pediatric neurologist, but would you
Yeah.
recommend that he get genetic testing? And if so, does that impact his, like things that come to mind are exclusions and insurance and moving into employment and things like that?
Certainly. Yeah, that's tough.
I guess as far as passing it on, I mean, if it is, his dad had seizures but grew out of it, and then our son has seizures and has not grown out of it.
Does he have a diagnosis?
He does, and for the life of me, I cannot remember the exact.
No, that's okay, but he has a known change. So one thing so part A is if he has a known change, then that ship has already sailed, right? Like as far as insurance might know and
Oh yeah.
all that.
Been on meds for a long time.
Yeah, so that information is already out there. It's unfortunate that we all even have to think about that side of things, but at least at this point, for your question, you're not talking about really doing anything new that would cause more trouble.
His last appointment in 17 well check or 16 well check was a definite diagnosis.
Yeah, and so the second part is I think the rest can wait. So if he decides that he does want to have a family, if there's a specific known change, then you're golden as long as people are okay with doing some family planning, right? Because you could potentially do assisted reproductive technologies with embryo screening for that specific change. You could know 100% that what went into mom was not something that had that change. You also could do it the other way and get pregnant the normal way, and depending on your feelings about terminating a pregnancy, but potentially fairly early, right? You could then screen to see whether the embryo at that time had that change or not, if that was something that was important to you. There are also, like, our patients with epilepsy, it's a big pain, but they're wonderful people. And so, it's not like some families wouldn't necessarily want even to act on that. They would be happy with the pregnancy. They would just want the information to know, hey, I got to be ready to hang in there through some seizures at this point. Luckily, it sounds like both affected people in your family have grown up to be successful adults who have their whole life in front of them. So fortunately, it's not one where, we expect, for instance, intractable seizures and death in the first 2 years of life. Like that would be one where you might really need to think hard about doing a lot of reproductive screening.
Our daughter has SCN1A. So I was thinking, because of that, she's been taking a lot of medicines. I was just, as what you were saying, her development skills isn't that great. She's doing her communication skills has a hard time. She has some delays. And so I'm curious to know if there's actually another gene mutation as you described besides what the doctors, because she did go through the gene therapy. Because she does have those traits. Is that another, not gene therapy, the gene testing?
Is the question whether the fact that she has development problems means something other than SCN1A? No, so very classic to have SCN1A causing development problems as well as epilepsy. I hesitate to ever say I can promise that something is absolutely not due to drugs in any one person, but in general, we know that the natural history of Dravet syndrome is to have both intractable epilepsy and development delays. And one of the reasons we're all so excited about this potential Stokey trial with the antisense oligonucleotide, which I don't know if you missed that part of the talk, but is that right now our epilepsy drugs stop seizures, but they don't do anything for the development, right? They don't salvage that part that's your child. It's like the core of what you love about your child, right? And so, I think everyone's hopeful that, in animal models, both the kind of development behavior stuff and the seizure stuff have been helped by the antisense oligos. And so the hope is whether that could also be translated to the human sphere, because we don't have anything to fix that right now. And it is one of the most frustrating things for folks with epileptic encephalopathy. Hey, another great question. So so genetic testing comes in about 400 flavors, right? There's everything from we're just going to check this one gene that your doctors think is wrong, or we're just going to look for Fragile X, to we're going to sequence your entire genome, right? And those are vastly different costs of tests and types of tests, and insurances have really bizarre policies about what they do and don't cover. What I would say about that in general is I'm very proud of our team because we have genetics docs who will go to the mat trying to get you testing if they think it's going to help you. And they have started their own nonprofit to try to cover testing for folks where we really can't get around it, but they also do appeals and reappeals from insurances that are being a pain. If you don't have a doctor who's doing that for you, who's like actually tried to put it through multiple times, you may have to fish around a little bit, because I know other geneticists I've worked with in the past who have not, it's just like, well, your insurance said no, and that's the end of it. And you can understand why if they don't have good support, if they don't have funding to have support for people to chase down the insurance. The doctor can't spend all the time doing that, but if you need it, you got to find someone who will do it for you, okay? I'm sorry, it's really frustrating to us too, because sometimes you're like, I know this person has a diagnosis, right? And you just can't get that testing done.
I came a little bit late, so I don't know if you talked about it. I know in another talk you talked about ASOs. How soon is that likely to kind of come into the market? And then also, we had heard earlier in one of the first talks we listened to today, where other genetic therapies are on the horizon, but then I thought I heard her say like 20 years. So I don't know. I don't know the range of genetic therapies in your, like what is like the timeline?
Yeah. Yeah, so I tried to give you a sense of like where some of the things that are going on right now. I don't know when you exactly came in, but there certainly are exciting things right now that we're doing, both in terms of drugs to prevent diseases that we know pathways for, and drugs to treat known genetic diseases. I guarantee there are many, many therapies that are going to affect genetic disease down the road that won't be developed for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. I mean, the science, I hope, is just going to keep going if we don't destroy our Earth first. So, we're hopefully going to keep making more and more progress. And if we've been exponential now, you can only imagine what other ideas are going to come in the future. So there certainly are going to be therapies that won't be available for many more years. I'm not sure if you were thinking of a specific one. Maybe you could talk to me after. Were you referring to embryonic stem cells being put in people's brains? Was that the first part of the question? ES cells?
There was a researcher in Ann Arbor
Mm-hmm.
who has got a proof of concept. I forget what, I don't know what I forget the research he was doing, but the speaker was really excited about it. It's still like a concept and stuff like that. So I don't know if you've heard of that particular research.
What was the topic?
Some genetic, the topic was
No, I mean, you said embryonic stem cells. Is that what you were asking about?
stem cells. It was genetic therapy.
Okay, you'd have to give me more information of what it was, but I'd be happy to talk after if you'd like.
So I know, and I don't know how far along, but regrowing cells and whatnot, would that, I know it's sort of related to that, but would it help with parts of the brain that have died off, per se, or help grow back cells, genetic cells?
I'm not sure if I'm totally following your question, but I think generally genetic epilepsies don't have large parts of the brain that have died off. It's usually the reason the brain's not working right is because there's a change in the code that's making up lots of the brain. So it's usually a very distributed process, which is why a lot of the time surgeries don't really help with genetic epilepsies, because it's something that's very distributed in the brain. So I don't think the goal for most genetic epilepsies right now is to try to repopulate dead cells. Is that answering what you're asking?
I think so.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Feel free to come up if you want to talk.